In June of 1841, German naturalist Ernst Diefenbach climbed to the crest of a hill on the North Island of New Zealand, and what he saw took his breath away. The view which opened, he wrote, was one of the grandest I ever beheld. There, amongst what he described as verdant hills and a deep lake of blue, was something extraordinary. He wrote, a flight of broad steps, the color of white marble with a rosy tint, a cascade of boiling water falling over them into the lake below. The sight that he beheld was described by contemporaries as the eighth wonder of the natural world, the Pink and White Terraces. They became a major tourist attraction for a while, but since have been lost and nearly forgotten.
New Zealand is believed to have been first populated by humans in the 14th century, when Polynesians arrived, the ancestors of today's Maori. European contact didn't come until centuries later. Abel Tasman briefly charted part of the islands in 1642, and James Cook circumnavigated the islands in 1769. The United Kingdom declared sovereignty over the islands in 1840. Following Cook's voyage, there was a significant contact between Europeans and the native Maori. In 1830, Thomas Chapman and his wife, Anne Maynard Chapman, arrived on the North Island of New Zealand as lay missionaries, assigned to several stations near Rotorua. Anne struggled in the frontier and rarely traveled, but according to the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography, is generally thought to have been the first European to see the Pink and White Terraces. Her husband likely did as well. She was certainly not the first person to view them, as the whole region was populated by Maori long before Europeans arrived, and the Maori revered the terraces as taonga, or treasures. Loosely translated, they called the White Terraces the Tattooed Rock and the smaller Pink Terraces fountains of the clouded sky. They sat on the edge of the Ratamahana, meaning hot lake, on top of the volcano called Mount Tarawera. The whole area was of significant spiritual value to the Maori people who lived there. The series of volcanic lakes and the streams that connected them also had deep connection to Maori history and mythology. Evelyn Stokes, a geography professor at the University of Waikato, summarized the legends of the origins of volcanic activity in the region in a paper from 2000. Ferdinand Hochstetter recorded the local story in 1859. In it, a great Maori tohunga, or priest, was attempting to summit a mountain. As he was freezing, he called to his sisters to send fire, and they sent baskets of fire with 2 mountain spirits. As the spirits traveled beneath the ground, they left holes for volcanic activity, such as Mount Tarawera. Another legend Stokes compiled relates that the priest met a spirit in the form of a person, or kind of a demon, who tried to destroy him with sorcery. The priest fought back with his own magic, trapping the spirit in the mountain. A guidebook to New Zealand called Maoriland, published by Alexander Wilson in 1884, described the three-peaked mountain. It looks bare and scarred, its steep walls rising up black and terrible as if blasted with lightning. The mountain was generally not settled and considered tapu, or sacred, not only for its connections to legend, but because it was used as a burial site. The Maori also had restrictions on visitation during the breeding season of the lake's plentiful waterfowl. The mountain's 3 pinnacles each had a name, which translate to split or cloven hole, bursting open, and burnt cliffs. The Maori may have remembered the last time the mountain erupted, around 1314. The site is very geologically active, as evidenced by geysers, thermal pools, and warm water. In 1859, geologist Ferdinand von Hochstetter wrote that doubtless thousands of years were required to form the spectacles, and more recent research by Rex Bunn suggests the White Terraces began forming around 7,000 years ago. Geologically, the terraces were formed of silica sinter, also called geyserite, a porous opaline silica often formed around hot springs. Geologist Patrick Marshall explains that the water of the hot pools is alkaline and contains much silica in the solution. As the water cools, some of the silica is deposited. As the cooling is most rapid on the margin of the pool, deposition is most rapid there, and a basin of white silica is gradually built up. Over thousands of years, these thin deposits created the magnificent features of the Pink and White Terraces. The White Terraces were the larger of the pair. Hochstetter described the 2 features in his 1864 report. The White Terrace was topped by a mighty bubbling spring, 80 feet long by 60 feet broad, and filled up to the brim with clear boiling water, which issues in the center several feet higher, looking beautifully blue in the snow-white encrusted basin. The overflow, he continued, had formed on the slope of the hill a system of crystal terraces, which, appearing almost white as marble, present a sight which is impossible to describe. The White Terraces covered an impressive roughly 20 acres, dropping 25 meters over 240 meters, making it likely the largest silica sinter deposit in the world. Hochstetter describes the pink springs as not so grand as those of the White Terraces, but more delicate and of a beautiful pink hue. The pink hue likely came from arsenic and antimony sulfides. The two terraces were only part of the geothermally active site, which Hochstetter says had 25 large hot springs. I dare not venture to estimate the number of the smaller ones. In addition to the pink and white, there was also a black terrace marked on Hochstetter's maps. After Anne Chapman and her husband Thomas had seen the springs, other missionaries might have as well. Archdeacon Brown traveled by them without comment. The next European expedition to the region came in 1841 when Ernst Diefenbach explored the area for the New Zealand Company. When he returned to England later that year, he published Travels in New Zealand, which brought significant attention to the site. The lake was small. Diefenbach says it was not more than a mile in circumference, but the region itself was difficult to get to, so only the wealthiest of travelers in the British Empire were able to reach the terraces. Despite that, the terraces were by standards of the 19th century tourist hotspots, as one of the most famous features of New Zealand. Reverend Seymour Mills Spencer, another missionary, eventually made his home at Lake Tarawera in 1844, where they built a European-styled community at Te Wairoa. Te Wairoa served as the base for many European visits to the terraces. Greater fame came when New Zealand Governor Sir George Grey visited in 1849. Grey left his initials carved into the silica. Hochstetter, an Austrian geologist, was hired in 1859 by the New Zealand government to make a geological survey of the islands. His survey included some of the only detailed maps of the terraces and Lake Ratamahana. With him was Daniel Mundy, who took photographs of the area. Indigenous resistance to colonization actually led Spencer and most others to abandon the region in the late 1860s. But despite the danger, in late 1870, Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, son of Queen Victoria, visited and bathed in the waters at the Pink Terrace. His visit spread news of the site, and a carriage road was built to the inaccessible region. By 1880, the location had become a bona fide tourist destination, despite ruts 18 inches deep and the roots, logs, and other fragments of trees which littered the road. Enterprising Maori took advantage. One opened the Duke of Edinburgh restaurant, and they used their longboats to transport tourists. In 1872, a visitor described the women working like demons as we shot rapidly over the waves. An accommodation house run by a Maori woman offered housing and a canoe always ready to convey passengers. Eventually, several hotels were built at Te Wairoa. Sunday in Tires, in a visitor's book, hinted at the occasional passing of specimens of the British tourist, wrote a correspondence in the Bay of Plenty Times in 1872. The Ratamahana Hotel eventually had 2 stories and included a dining room, drawing room, and smoking room. The competing Terrace Hotel was smaller but pleasant and comfortable, according to a contemporary guidebook. By the early 1880s, there were 2 prominent guides, both women. Kate Middlemass, with a form like an Amazon's, features like a prizefighter's, and an arm that would fell an ox, who had earned a medal from the Royal Humane Society for saving tourists when a canoe capsized, and guide Sophia Hinarangi, half Scot and half Maori. In her 50s, she was slight, graceful, and delicate, with a quiet, interesting manner, as one tourist described her, and well-educated and bilingual. Visits to the terraces then meant rising in the morning, taking a boat across the lake, generally bigger now than the old canoes, eating potatoes boiled in the spring, and bathing, usually at the Pink Terrace, whose water was considered softer and silkier than the White Terrace. All the while, visitors described the stunning sights, which today are remembered only by descriptions, paintings, and black and white photographs. Even imparting in any way a full idea of its wonders, one visitor wrote, "The task is simply impossible." The lake itself was not impressive, but the terraces elicited poetic description. The steps, as also the basins, are of the most graceful forms possible. No wit could possibly conceive or execute anything half as beautiful. The constant pouring of the water over their edges has rounded them off in the most graceful curves, the incrustations resembling in many places plumes of ostrich feathers in high relief, or the beautiful arabesques to be seen on a frosted window pane. Another visitor described the tracery as petrified yak lace and fleecy wool, disposed in the most tasteful folds and pendant masses. George Cooper, George Gray's secretary, said the Pink Terraces were at the bottom white as marble. A little higher up it becomes pinkish, then a beautiful salmon color, which deepens to a roseate hue, until at the upper range of all, the rock is of a delicate primrose color. Another wrote that the crystals projected from the rocky walls over the abyss till they seemed to dissolve not into darkness, but into light. The hue of the waters was something which I had never seen, and shall never see again, this side of eternity. With the tourists came money. White Fungus magazine notes that the tribe was making £6,000 annually, but also destruction, as it ever does. One visitor decried the graffiti on one of the terraces by Cockney-sold tourists. Hundreds of names are ultimately inscribed, like George Gray, along with members of the House of Representatives, government officials, and Army and Navy officers. Hochstetter, for his good work, complained that the substance of the terraces is so hard as to require an axe for breaking off a specimen. Litter decorated the edges, much of it soon enshrined under the new layers of silica. The Maori eventually came down hard on this behavior and even prevented scientific boring efforts to protect the site. Many tried to savor the memory in photographs and art, and the local Maori enforced a £5 charge for painting, on the grounds that if money was made on the sale of photographs and paintings, the local people deserved to profit. Charles Blomfield paid a lump sum for complete freedom from interference for his painting, some of the best remaining depictions of the terraces. But all of the beauty, the tourism, and the painting was destined to come to a sudden and violent end. On May 31st, 1886, Guide Sophia led a party of tourists to the lake, where they found the creek dry and their boats in the mud. Whilst we were standing there, the water began to come up with a crying sound all along the shores of the lake, Sophia described, only for the water to rush back again, leaving the creek as dry as before. The tourists were disconcerted, but the Maori boatmen wanted to continue the expedition. Missing it would mean a substantial loss of money. Once they were on the water, Sophia described a different portent. A canoe appeared on the water. First it appeared small, before growing large, looking like one of the old Maori war canoes with 13 people, paddling fast. Sophia says, to our horror, they appeared to have dogs' heads and the bodies of men. While this may seem fantastic and mythical, the canoe itself, sans dog heads, was seen by everyone on the boat. Mrs. Sissa, one of the tourists, described it. We saw in the distance a large boat, looking glorious in the mist and sunlight. It was full of Maoris, some standing up, and it was near enough for me to see the sun glittering on the paddles. Her husband said the men on the boat were too far off to make out clearly and thought they were 9 men, not 13. He says several of the figures stood up. Another tourist, William Quick, later said that it was to all appearances a war canoe of olden time. At least one other boat on the lake also saw the phantom canoe. Some describe one of the figures with their hair plumed for death with bird feathers. More unsettling, when Sophia described it to other elders, they took it as a bad omen, and reports quickly circulated that there had been no canoes like the one they saw on the lake for at least a generation. Several Maori believe the portent was a dire one. Explanations have ranged from a freak wave or even a buried canoe shaken loose by geological activity. There were other events later taken as portents. A chief had died, and according to a June 18, 1886 article in the Otonga Daily Times, an infernal character skilled in the black art was suspected in his death. Typhoid had also been rampant, killing at least a dozen Maori in the region. Over the next week, Sophia continued to note strange behavior on the lake. She described the water as unusually high, reported a geyser spewing flames and smoke. Signs had actually been appearing for months. In November 1885, the geyser at the top of the White Terrace erupted higher than ever before. Just after midnight on the morning of June 10th, the first of around 30 earthquakes was felt, increasing in magnitude. By 1:30 a.m., the eruption began. Dark smoke billowed. Inna Hazard recalled that the fiery electric balls darted in every direction. Hazard's father and some of her siblings were killed in the eruption. William Byrd said that the mountain was reflected in the lake, above which hung the great cloud curtain, gloomy and dark above, saffron and orange on its undersurface. From the cloud, great balls of flaming rocks splashed into the waters of the lake. At 2:10, another powerful earthquake struck, and an eruption column rose 9 kilometers into the air, soon followed by basaltic scoria eruptions, explosions of basaltic lava which create steep craters. For those beneath the eruption, the scene was apocalyptic. The windows were smashed in, and we found that what we had taken for rain was scoria and stone. The wind, blowing violently, was veering and shifting in every direction, one survivor described. The schoolhouse burned, and the schoolmaster was killed when his adjacent house collapsed. These explosions racked the land, ripping an 8-kilometer fissure down the mountain. All 3 of the mountain's peaks would erupt, throwing their own distinct columns of smoke and ash. The rift continued to grow, and at 3:30 the largest phase of the eruption began. The rift spread into the lake, and the resulting magma-water contact caused an enormous explosion that left a 2-kilometer crater, spreading wet ash and eject over 10,000 square kilometers. annihilating several nearby villages. The eruption was felt at least as far as Christchurch, 500 miles away. Cold mud rained down on Te Wairoa, where Sophia and others were huddled in their homes or at the hotels. Other buildings collapsed, but Sophia's home held thanks to its steep roof. She later estimated more than 60 people sought shelter at her home, many of them retreating from collapsing buildings elsewhere in the village. Ultimately, the eruption left at least 13 separate craters, with a volcanic explosivity index of 5, indicating a highly destructive event, and the same BEI as the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. By morning, the eruption was largely over, but ash blocked out the sun until late afternoon. Survivors began searching the ruined landscape, now as unfamiliar as the moon. A lakeside village, along with 39 people, was buried under dozens of feet of mud. The estimated death toll is around 120, with estimates as high as 150, although the true number is uncertain. The Maori reported several thousand, although later examinations suggested that that doesn't match recent census reports. Nearly all of the dead were Maori. The terraces simply disappeared, despite some reports at the time that they had survived. Most assumed the terraces had simply been vaporized, although Alfred Warbrick, a half-Maori local, believed that the terraces might have survived and advocated for their excavation. Many of the Maori believed the eruption was divine punishment for misconduct, possibly even for turning the terraces into a money-making venture. Sophia remembered an old chief offering her honey collected from the mountain, which was sacred. She claimed that anyone who ate the honey died in the eruption. It was also seen as revenge of the demon the priest trapped in the mountain. In the years that followed, Lake Ratamahana refilled, now considerably larger than its former iteration. New geothermal systems formed, and the area is still renowned for its hot springs. Sophia continued to work as a guide, though she moved elsewhere. Te Wairoa was never rebuilt, and today is a tourist destination in its own right as the Buried Village. The meeting house that stood there was dismantled and now stands in a park in Surrey, in the United Kingdom.
For most of the 140 years since the eruption, the terraces were assumed to have been lost, destroyed in the eruption. But recent research, some of it spurred by the rediscovery of Hutchetter's survey, has reignited interest in their possible survival. Researchers disagree. Were they destroyed, or were the terraces sunk beneath the surface of the lake, or maybe hidden along the new shoreline? Might they someday again, part of them at least, be seen? The whole region was altered. For the people that lived there, nothing would ever be the same again. Those terraces, which took millennia to form, were lost in a period of just a few hours, never to be seen again. It all goes to remind you that even in the grand geological history of the Earth, nothing is forever. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.